Okay, so lecture number 10, Fernando Raul from Puerto Rico has joined me. And imagine how Rahu has functioned in today's 21st century. Media has developed a lot, and we are live streaming from Zoom to Facebook to each other's social media pages.
To
And
Instagram.
to
Also, I'm doing
Instagram.
Instagram here.
So we have like 6 to 7 links here uh, in terms of how things are functioning, and it is almost amazing. So Fernando is kind of going to take us through the guidelines to differentiate modern and traditional astrology. So thank you so much, Fernando, for joining me, and it's always a pleasure having you.
Thank you, Ashwin. So I'll take it off then.
Yeah, I'll be off, and you can just let me know whenever you want me to.
So are you going to be invisible?
Invisible. I'm going to be invisible. I'll also be mute. So just let me know whenever you want me. Okay, I'll be back.
Okay.
I'll
You're gonna go to sleep. That's what you're gonna
No, I'll be there listening your lecture. So just let me know whenever you want me to come. Okay, so I'll be there.
Yeah, sure. So can you see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. So let's start.
Sure.
So I just want to say hello to everyone. And oh my God, we're in the last one. No, I want to go to the first one. Oh God, it's thinking. Let's just wait for the computer to start. So, oh God, there we go. The last one. Oh no. Okay. So I just want to thank Ashwin for inviting me here. And as he said, what we're going to do in this conference, in this little presentation, we're going to be talking about tradition and modernity. We're going to be talking about how these precepts apply to the astrological practice, both modern and classic. So let's see.
Fernando,
Ashwin,
can you just switch to slideshow, which will be much better?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was in slideshow. Can you see it now?
No. Can you just give Shift plus F5, which kind of takes it to slideshow? If I'm not wrong. Oh shit. Okay.
There we go. Oh man, it won't let me. Let me see. Let me see if I can stop it here. And let's share it again. And let's see it. There you go. Can you see it?
Yeah. Can you just click on the right the menu bar on the top? You have slideshow, second from last.
In the top. Okay. You mean
home, themes, tables, charts, smart art, transitions, animations?
Slideshow.
Yes.
There you go. So it would be
presenter view.
Presenter view. There you go. And I'm gonna share it. No, it won't let me, man.
Okay, don't worry. Just continue. No worries.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No problem.
Yeah, because everyone can see the other slides. But so far, so good. So yeah, let's just. Is it visible, right?
It's absolutely visible. So don't worry.
Okay, so yeah, so basically the presentation is called Being and Becoming, and what we're gonna do here is that we're gonna be discussing clear guidelines to differentiate between traditional astrology and modern astrology. And if people don't know it, we live in the modern age. So basically we are taking a modern perspective toward this subject. And I imagine that most practicing astrologers have a vague idea of what traditional astrology is and what modern astrology is. And I'm pretty sure that most traditional astrologers have a clear idea on what the differentiations are between these two applications in the astrological practice. And I can also imagine that some modern astrologers have an idea. But practicing astrology, I've noticed that there isn't a clear-cut definition in the minds of many astrologers. And that's why I want to do this conference, to set some clear guidelines to really, identify what is what, okay? So in essence, let's start the conference with the idea of, tradition and modernity. And you have this picture of two brothers. I mean, by the way, I didn't take this picture. I just stole it from the internet. But in essence, we see here that these are two twin brothers. They're identical, but they're clearly very different, just like modern astrology and traditional astrology are. You see one of the kids who is going to become a monk, who's going to become a priest, and the other, you know, is deeply involved in modern culture, in modern popular culture. They might speak the same language, but probably they talk about very different things. And at the same time, they both look the same, as we just mentioned, but they dress differently and value different things, right? The main difference might be that, you know, the kid who's going to become a monk is going to dress as a monk until the day he dies, unless he changes the career he is doing. And the other kid, he's going to, you know, wear that AC/DC shirt, but maybe tomorrow he's going to change his liking in music, or maybe he's just going to drop music, and he's going to be constantly changing. And that's the idea of the title of this presentation, about being and becoming. And that's something that you have to have in mind. You know, tradition is, while modernity is becoming, right? And we're going to see how this extrapolates all throughout the presentation. So the next slide, you know, tradition and modernity, what are they, right? You know, and in a way, you know, they are two different all-encompassing world views, okay? And this reminds us a little bit about the ninth house, a little bit about Sagittarius. These are basically philosophical outlooks on life. One is tradition, obviously, and the other, obviously, is modernity. And in this conference, we're going to be distinguishing 8 clear guidelines to see how these different philosophical outlooks apply to the practice of astrology, okay? And not only are there 2 different all-encompassing worldviews, there are also 2 opposing perspectives on what life is. And there are 2 forces in history that have shaped our present world. And in a way, you know, they are like a yin and a yang. Some people might even call it the forces of civilization and the forces of barbaric invasions, and so on and so forth. But we have to really delve into this subject to really identify what is what. So let's start very fast to talk about the misconceptions about tradition. Before we define the term, we have to be very clear on what is not tradition, because this is something that is sometimes very present in the mind of the neophyte. This is something that is very present in the common layman mind. So first of all, the term does not apply only to folkloric customs from around the world. You know, tradition is not only the dance from your native country, it's not only the food you eat, it's not like artisan artifacts that people do in the countryside where you live. Usually these customs are part of tradition, that's true, but they're like the lesser part of tradition. And not only that, in the modern context, they are disconnected from the traditional essence that gave them meaning, okay? Because all these customs, the dance, the food, the artifacts, you know, they have a traditional context, they have a traditional root, but, you know, sometimes this is not present in modern times. So in a way, these customs are like the last vestiges of old traditions, okay? And at the same time, you know, tradition is not, it's not a term, I mean, the tradition does not apply only to archaic customs in ancient cultures. And, you know, sometimes we kind of have this residue of old customs through the holidays we celebrate. For example, here in the West, you know, Christmas is celebrated more or less on the winter solstice. And that's basically the celebration of the winter solstice seen through this Christian tradition that once again today is slowly dying. And at the same time, we can see this with all the holidays that still survive today through different perspective, through different filters. But we are not talking here about like bringing back or reminiscing on old traditions, like for example, Saturnalia in the old Roman world and so on and so forth. You know, we are not saying that old customs that no longer exist are specific traditions. They are traditions, but this is not the meaning of the term, okay? And finally, you know, the term tradition does not apply to secular modern customs, you know, particular family traditions, nor other modern customs of a consumerist nature. You know, tradition is not, you know, the secret recipe that your mother uses to, you know, cook curry. You know, it's not the secret recipe that your mother uses to cook a Thanksgiving turkey. And it's obviously not modern consumerist traditions, like, for example, Black Friday, you know, the Friday after Thanksgiving, where everything is, on sale on stores and so on and so forth. So we have to take this into consideration before we proceed to define what tradition is. And at the same time, let's see the other side of the coin. Let's see what modernity is not. You know, and modernity is not, you know, the term does not apply only to that which is current or present. You know, sometimes people think that modernity is like right now. And yes, that is the meaning of the word. But from the philosophical point of view, that is just part of the meaning, because this is the literal meaning that you might see in a dictionary, but it's not the philosophical, epistemological meaning that we're looking for in this presentation. At the same time, the term is not something that has been surpassed or overcome, e.g. postmodernism. You know, there are some intellectuals that state that after 1989, specifically after the downfall of the Soviet Union, then modernity is over and now we are in a post-modernist situation, which, you know, from a philosophical point of view, from a certain school of thought, that might be true. And we are citing here Fukuyama's theory of the end of history. We can also cite, you know, Foucault's theories on postmodernism. But the idea is that this, in my opinion, you know, we might say that this is the end of history, and in 200 years, we're going to say again that it's the end of history, and so on and so forth. But we are just going along a train of thought that is the modern way of thinking, okay? And at the same time, the last point here, you know, the term does not apply to an artistic or social movement. You know, modernism is an artistic movement that originated at the beginning of the 20th century, but that's not necessarily the meaning of the term that we are employing here, okay? So, you know, now we know what these terms are not. Now let's define what they are. So, in a way, what is tradition? You know, tradition, etymologically, it simply means that which is transmitted. You know, it's something that is closely related to the original definition of what religion is. You know, religion is basically like a chain, like a transgenerational chain that transmit the important values that make up a society in the human context, okay? And as you can see, tradition has a close meaning to religion, but it's not necessarily religion, okay? At the same time, tradition is related to the traditional religions of the world, but not exclusively relegated to them, which is what I just said. Tradition can be oral or written. Here we can cite, you know, the holy books. We can cite the Bhagavad Gita. We can cite the Bible, the Quran. You know, we can even cite the Tao Te Ching. And in a way, these books originally were oral in essence, and they were written eventually in book forms. You know, from the Vedic perspective, this was done to ensure that the tradition was kept during the Kali Yuga. For example, in the Christian tradition, the Gospels were written 70 years after, you know, the death and resurrection of Christ, and so on and so forth. At the same time, traditional is hierarchical, okay, and organic. And, you know, let me just go back a little bit about that tradition, oral and written. We have also to realize that, as I just said, tradition does not specifically appeal to religion only. We can also think about initiatic leagues of how, you know, secret societies, schools of mystery transmitted a certain traditional lore through secret oral initiations. And at the same time, as I said, these were hierarchical institutions, and in a way, they were organic. Of course, you know, some people are going to object to that term, that these are organic or organizations, but in a way, this has been the way human society has been organized since we know about history, okay? And at the same time, going to the theme here, there are different levels that merges through these hierarchical institutions, both in religion and initiatic leagues. And it's organic because this is just done through the will of great men that initiate these processes, that initiate these great systems based on tradition. But in essence, and this is a very important point, tradition postulates the idea that there exists a perennial wisdom, or Sophia perennis, that holds the primordial and universal truths from which all traditional religions emanate from and share. Okay, and this is a very important thing. Traditionalists, perennialists postulate the idea that all of the main religions, the real religions, I might add, originate from the same metaphysical sinew, from the same metaphysical human impulses that are basically different routes to the same circle, which might be God. And this applies mainly to all religions before the 16th century, okay? All religions after that are just, I don't want to say inventions, but they're just based on a modern context, as we're going to see later on with the historical chronology. And we are here saying that, as we know from the history of religions, this applies to the most ancient religion that we know of, which is the Vedic religion, and stems to the last of the traditional religions that was founded, which is surprisingly, once again, one that is from a Vedic context, that was Sikhism. Everything else after that, Protestantism, religions that have to do with spiritualism, syncretism, theosophy, anthroposophy, to a certain extent, modern atheisms, are just modern ways of thinking outside of the traditional lore, okay? At the same time, tradition is based on faith and metaphysical institution, and I wrote, that's a typo, and metaphysical institutions, which are basically, once again, quoting the idea of religions. At the same time, tradition sees time as cyclical in traditional thought. I mean, time is cyclical in traditional thought, not linear. I have to stop improvising. I just have to read. Time is cyclical in traditional thought and not linear. This is the idea that, time are just wheels upon wheels, which kind of reminisce in the idea of traditional astrology. And at the same time, time is not something that is constantly going forward and progressing. That would be more of the modern perspective on what life is. And at the same time, we can quote the idea of the kalpas, of the yugas in the Vedic tradition. And we can also quote the ages of Hesiod in the Greek context of the Iron Age, the Bronze Age, the Silver Age, and the Golden Age, okay? And this is very important. Tradition evokes the idea of a human society where the center of it are perennial metaphysical principles, that is religion, God, initiatic leagues, etc., from which everything else emanates. And this is very, very important. Traditional society is basically a circle where the center is God, is the metaphysical. It's basically the intangible, the things that are not material, but the things that are above us and that we should ascribe to. And this leads us to the last of the definitions in terms of what tradition is, which is that man is something constant. Man does not change. Man does not evolve, as the modern term of evolution stipulates. Man is something that is meant to be transcended and overcome. Hence, death is something to be overcome through the intangible. This is the idea of moksha, for example, in the Vedic tradition, the idea of just liberating yourself from this eternal cycle of coming back. And at the same time, this also relates to the Judeo-Christian idea of heaven, of just leaving this world and going to the next level. So that is what tradition is in a nutshell, okay? And, this is very important because this is going to be a guideline that we're going to see later on when we go to the astrological part, that death is seen very different from the modern perspective than from the traditional perspective, and hence reincarnation is also seen from a different perspective, okay? So let's go and define what modernity is. We just said what tradition is. Now modernity, etymologically, modernity simply means presently. And this was a term that was began to be used in the middle medieval age. I don't know how to say that in English. Would be like, for example, 13th, 14th century, late medieval ages, more or less, medieval ages. And it means just the way things are in the present day. Okay, so that once again stipulates the idea that we mentioned before, that that's really the definition of modernity, literally, but it's much more than that. And at the same time, you know, modernity is related to the secular forms of life that emanate from the European Enlightenment. If tradition is related to the spiritual and religion, then modernity is related to the secular forms of life that began in Europe, in the Enlightenment, specifically in the 17th and 18th century, but we can also stipulate that it began before that with the idea of the Renaissance, and also we can say that it began a little bit after with the Reformation, and even some people say that it began with, you know, the Greeks back in the 4th century BC. But the idea is that modernity says, you know, we don't need spirituality anymore. We have transcended the metaphysical, and now we just want to become secular. And what does that mean? Well, you know, modernity postulates the equality through legal fiction. It stipulates the idea that everyone is the same, that there are no hierarchies, there are no cycles, and that we're basically, you know, like leaves on a tree. We're all the same. Obviously, we could use much harsher metaphors, but we're not going to do that here. And at the same time, modernity postulates the idea of a secular society separated from religious beliefs, betting on humanism, individualism, relativism, materialism, and technical progress. And this is done through equality through the laws, which are, once again, these legal fictions, the constitutions, the legal documents that, you know, are absolute, but sometimes they're not as absolute as they say. And these came to be through constitutions, through revolutions, through equality, liberty, and fraternity that more or less began in the age of enlightenment in the 17th and 18th century. At the same time, modernity is based on evolution, progress, and the economical. This is a very important point that people have to have in mind. Modernity is based on the idea that everything is changing, and that we, in the context of materiality and physical life, we are achieving newer and newer things, and, you know, amassing more and more experiences and more things in order to grow in this world. And that is evolution, that is progress, and this is done through technique, through the material and the economical. Okay. At the same time, time is linear in modern thought, not cyclical. As we said before, this is the idea of the yugas, the kalpas, the ages in tradition. Modernity cancels that out and says that basically history is just a progression of human development towards, you know, the infinite, right? Nobody knows where progress is leading us, but this is the idea of the modern thought. And this is clearly stipulated in the Marxist perspective, where historical materialism stipulates the idea of how, you know, man has gone from a hunter-gatherer to, you know, a hunter-gatherer living in cities. But no, it's from a hunter-gatherer to, you know, a citizen of the world. At the same time, modernity evokes the idea of a human society where the center of it are economical and materialistic principles. You know, and these are natural. When we say economical principles, we're basically referring to the basic principles of what economy is, and that would be, you know, natural resources, human resources, you know, natural resources being, you know, the elements, the minerals, the food that we grow, human resources being the people, the employees, the citizens, capital, which is not only money, but it's basically the technique, the technology that we use to create richness, and obviously usury, which is very important in this context of modernity, especially from a European context. And this is the idea from which everything emanates in the modern society. In the traditional society, God, transcendence, the metaphysical was the center of it, right? While in modernity, everything is money, everything are numbers, everything statistics, everything is what can you do to be productive, and everything emanates from that, okay? And in the modern perspective, man is something that is constantly evolving and changing. Here's where the idea of progress, of evolution comes in. Evolution from the Darwinistic point of view. We are constantly changing. You know, now we're talking about there's no such thing as gender. Now we're going to be talking about, you know, transhumanist approaches to life, being, you know, using chips, using machinery. You know, I have my phone here. You know, phones are basically an extension of us. And it's the idea of the linear progress. We don't know where we're going. We're just amassing more experience, amassing more progress, and amassing more in the economical context. And, you know, this is very important because in the traditional perspective, man is something to be transcended. Man is something that is meant to be left behind through moksha, through the liberation, through, you know, salvation of the soul. But here, you know, there is no such thing because there's no space for God. There's no space for the metaphysical. And if there's a space for the metaphysical, as we're going to see later on, it's extremely relegated to this modernistic perspective. And we have to have something very clear in mind. The modern perspective is anomalous to all known history until now. From the 18th and 17th century until now, we are living in a society that is purely anomalous to the rest of history. It's the first time where man has just, you know, walked away from God, walked away from the metaphysical in terms of how it relegated their society. And as I said, it began in Europe, and through the process of globalization, it has spread to all the countries in the world. So before we move on to the astrological part, we have this idea of what tradition and modernity is. Now we're going to see what, you know, famous thinkers have said about modernity. You know, Julius Evola, which is the great Italian, you know, traditional intellectual, said, tradition in its essence is something simultaneously meta-historical. That means that it's something that is more than history, more than human, and dynamic. It is something that can adapt itself to the different cultures. That's why tradition expresses itself through different religions throughout the world, because throughout the world, different people have different necessities in relation to their geography, in relation to their, their basic needs, their principal worries in life. That's why, you know, Vedic religion expresses in a way, Christianity expresses in another way, Chinese thought expresses in another way, and so on and so forth. But they all have this Sophia Perennis involved in the process of the metaphysical. At the same time, it is an overall ordering force in the service of principles that have the chrism of a superior legitimacy, Sophia Perennis. We may even call them principles from above, okay? Gustav Mahler, he was Austrian-Hungarian, but he was, you know, German-speaking back then. But he was more of an Austrian musician. He said, tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of the fire. This is the idea of, you know, tradition is not the idea that, oh, no, we have to go back to ancient Greek culture. We have to go back to ancient Vedic times and bring them to modernity. No, it's the idea of adapting that Sophia Perennis to the modern context, right? To the modern technological context, to the modern techniques that we use in the world. Of course, if we want to bring that here, it's the idea of using that Sophia Perennis, you know, the fire, to create a new torchbearer and not necessarily, you know, praise the ashes of, you know, cultures that are long gone. And if you want to learn more about these cycles of how cultures are how cultures are born, grow, and die, you should check, you know, Oswald Spengler, who wrote, you know, The Decline of the West, which is the idea of how the West is dying and how other civilizations also die. And he describes certain cycles. It's the idea of tradition should be something that should be brought back in the context of where we're living. The great Colombian thinker, that's a very young photograph of him, by the way, Nicolás Gómez Dávila, said, modern man is a prisoner who thinks he's free because he refrains from touching the walls of his dungeon. And the dungeon is the idea that we are kept here in the modern context. Man, in the traditional context, is something to be transcended, right? But in the modern context, there's no space for God. There's no space for moksha. There's no space for heaven. Even there's no place for hell. There is no place for this dynamic chain of being, which was so important in the Renaissance thought of Europe. And in the way, this is the idea of death. Death is seen as something that we don't have an answer to, that we don't know, as something that is terminal many times from the modern existentialist perspective, from the modern perspective, from the postmodern perspective. And that's the dungeon, the idea that we have removed that fire that Mahler talked about, that we have removed that meta-historical force that Ebola talks about from our current modern life. And this is where all the malices of modern life come in, depression, drug use, suicide, and all that. And finally, we have the great Italian Marxist thinker, Antonio Gramsci, who said the challenge of modernity is to live without illusions and without becoming disillusioned. And that's a very, very big challenge. Life, Artha is very important as a Purushartha from the Vedic perspective, the idea of materiality and all that. Also, Kama is very important, the idea of the pleasure that we receive through the five senses and the mind. But also moksha and dharma are very important. And in modern context, we don't have that very present, or at least, the status quo from liberal democracies, modern republics do not have that present. Of course, there are some countries that do have that present, but obviously from the modern perspective, we can cite Iran, for example, which is a theosophy. And maybe we could also cite, the communist countries of the world, like Cuba, North Korea, and so on, where they see, materialism as a religion. Of course, they're not going to say that, but this is just a perspective. But this is the challenge, right? And this is very interesting because tradition, from the Ebolian point of view, is related to the high castes of the Vedic system. The idea of the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas governing the people, the Shudras and the Vaishyas, and also the Dalits and the Mleshas, if you want to add them too, from the traditional perspective of where time is cyclical, where man is something to be transcended, while in modernity is something that more applies to the Vaishyas, to the Shudras that have to relate more to the bhutas of Prithvi or earth and of air, where, time is not cyclical, it's linear, money is important, the rights of the Shudras are important, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, we have to give it to modernity. We have to talk about the positive facts about modernity. Not everything is bad about it, and the only way to justify the positive things about modernity is not through these quotes, these poetic quotes, these artistic quotes that I just mentioned. It's more about statistics, about numbers, about, the things that really define modernity. And, for example, we have reached to a certain degree the lowest child mortality rate in history in many countries. We have also reached the eradication of certain disease and on average a longer lifespan, right? We have, of course, we have a lowest child mortality rate in history, but we also have the highest rate of abortions in human history. So, give or take. At the same time, we have the eradication of certain diseases and on average a longer lifespan. But at the same time, cases of mental maladies, suicide, depression, drug use is very, very generalized, okay? Great leaps in global communication. This is a very good point. Right now I am in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Ashwin is in Chennai, India, and there are other people seeing this conference in other parts of the world. At the same time, there have been great leaps in technology that make life easier and safer. But of course, that also brings the idea of nihilism coming in, the idea of boredom coming in, existentialism coming in, the idea that, man needs that dharmic feeling, that those obstacles, those, what's the word in English? Those things that really defy him in life in order to become greater. At the same time, good things, we have deep sea exploration, we have space exploration, we're going out. See, this is the idea. In traditional thought, we go within. In modern thought, we go out. And now we're talking about Mars colonization, lunar colonization, and also, deep sea exploration. And at the same time, basic human rights and a generally less violent world. This is very true. In many countries, security rights have improved the quality of life. But at the same time, you know, we've created also probably, you know, an ecological situation which is kind of hard towards the flora and fauna of the world. And I'm not talking about global warming or climate change. No, I'm talking about, you know, the extinction of certain species, pollution, pollution of the ocean, and so on and so forth. So this is how we can justify the positive aspects of modernity versus the positive aspects of tradition. Okay, we see that in tradition there's a certain angst, a certain nostalgia, certain artistic quality to the quotes I mentioned, and the positivity of modernity are just numbers, statistics, very cold. Okay, so now let's move on to the astrological part. Okay, because now we're going to apply this and see how this expresses itself to identify the 8 guidelines that I've created to really know what modern astrology is and what traditional astrology is. Because there's a problem. Today, most astrologers do not have this historical context that I just said and that I'm about to expand on further frames, slides, I mean. But at the same time, they tend to mix things together. They tend to, you know, just mix things without knowing what they really are. So first of all, let's talk about history, a chronology. What is traditional astrology? As I said, traditional astrology extends from the 5th century BC to the 18th century AD, when the idea of modern thought began in Europe. So basically, you know, academically, the earliest astrology that we know comes from Babylon, from Chaldean astrology, from more or less 400 BC. But some people say there are other tablets even further, from maybe the 6th or 7th century. At the same time, you know, Indian thought, some people believe that astrology is much, much older than that, maybe a couple of millennia old. I've heard people quote professors from Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan in New Delhi say that astrology has been with man for 14,000 years, 16,000 years. But whatever, you know, academically, we know that astrology is at least from the 5th century BC, and this is not horoscopic astrology. This is just basically, you know, basic sidereal ecliptic positions and so on and so forth. And it kind of ended in the 18th century when, to a certain degree, astrology almost disappeared from Europe. And we're going to see why. And this is about a span of 2,300 years at least. While modern astrology originated, in essence, from the 18th century AD onward towards the present day. And this is basically 320 years at most. And it's very curious to say that at the same time, in the 18th century, we began to discover the trans-Saturnian planets. The asteroids were discovered a little bit earlier, but at the same time, we can say, you know, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries when we start to discover all these objects that are used a lot more in modern astrology than in traditional astrology. So what are traditional astrological schools? As I said, we have to take into consideration all astrological schools from the ancient past until the 18th century AD. And these are basically Chaldean, Babylonian astrology, Egyptian astrology, Hellenistic astrology, which kind of mixes both astrology of Babylon and Egyptian in the Hellenistic context that evolves into the Roman context. Then, you know, the Roman astrology goes to Byzantium, and then from Byzantium goes to the Muslim world. And then you have a Muslim astrology, but at the same time, you have Jyotish being influenced by Hellenistic astrology, by Muslim astrology, being mixed with the Vedic astrology that's very, very, very old, the lunar astrology of the nakshatras, of the tithis. Then you have Tibetan astrology, which is like a mixture of Chinese and Jyotish. You also have Chinese astrology. And then, you know, after the medieval ages, the late medieval ages, the Europeans start to translate the Arab text of Muslim astrology, which at the same time is the Hellenistic and Egyptian Chaldean astrology of old, and they retransmit that to create medieval and Renaissance astrology, which is basically the last wave of traditional astrology that we know of. And I also have to consider here the idea of Mesoamerican astrology, which is the astrology of, you know, of ancient Mexico, of the Mayans and Aztecs. Although, you know, some interpretations of this astrology extrapolate from modern context, but we have to add it here. You know, authentic Mesoamerican astrology is something that's very interesting that we have to see. There are some authors that work here. And at the same time, we should also add other astrological schools lost to time. Here we have to think about probably I've always thought that there might have been an astrology in the Incan Empire that we're not really sure about. Also, we have to think maybe of some astrological lores of the Pacific, of Polynesia. Maybe there's something there. Maybe there's something in Africa that we're unaware of, or that maybe it has died off. But we have to see this from the traditional perspective. And this would be, you know, traditional schools. Now, modern schools, as we've said, stem from the 18th century onward to the present day. And this is very important because in the 18th century began the basis of what modern astrology would be. And the 18th century, we have the Enlightenment. We also had a little bit before that, the scientific revolution. We have the idea of heliocentrism and how it changes all the perspective in the European cosmology. And at the same time, in the 19th century, we start seeing a renaissance in astrology in Europe that, you know, is basically the father and the mother of the modern astrology that we have in the 20th century. And this stems mainly from European spiritism and the theosophical approaches, right? And some people, you know, might object to this, but theosophy and spiritism is purely modern. Spiritism is basically, you know, contacting, you know, death, desencarnados, as I say in Spanish. It's basically unincarnated entities, and this has been known throughout history. But, you know, that's what spiritism does, and we're not going to talk to that because that would be, you know, another lecture. And theosophy, what it does, it takes, you know, the Eastern knowledge, specifically Vedic knowledge, and reinterprets it from the modern perspective of a progress, modern perspective of an evolution, progress perspective, and so on and so forth. And modern astrology includes everything from the 18th century onward. Of course, theosophical astrology is from the 19th century, but, you know, I added the 18th century because of the things I said. And at the same time, in the 18th century, you have the discovery of Uranus. In the 19th century, the discovery of Neptune. In the 20th century, the discovery of Pluto. And in the 21st century, we're still discovering trans-Neptunian objects, okay? So basically, you have theosophical astrology, you have anthroposophical astrology, which is basically the break from theosophy from the Austrian thinker, oh God, I forgot his name. Anthroposophical astrology. Then you have psychological astrology, which also comes in after the theosophist and the spiritist. Then you have evolutionary astrology, you have cosmobiology, or cosmobiology, and Uranian astrology, which was the Hamburg school of astrology that separated. You have New Age astrology with these ideas of the age of Aquarius, also seen from this progressive evolutionary perspective. We have heliocentric astrology, where the center of the chart is basically the sun. Topocentric astrology, very popular in Latin America. Human design, which is something that came to a man who supposedly got it from divine inspiration. And, you know, modern interpretations of other traditional schools and other schools that are just developing as we go on. Because you have to remember, traditional is solid. Traditional does not change. Modern expresses progress, evolution. So, you know, for example, the term Vedic astrology is a very modern term that, you know, Europeans coined. All these Europeans in the counterculture era in the 60s, they just came into this idea of Vedic culture, and they started calling Hindu astrology, Jyotisha, Vedic astrology to sell books in a certain degree. So yeah, and also today we have other phenomena, like, for example, career astrology, which tries to change the traditional significations of the planet and so on and so forth. But this is basically the modern schools of astrology versus the traditional schools of astrology. Okay, so now, finally, we're going to start talking about the different guidelines that we're going to use to identify the differences between traditional astrology and modern astrology. So basically, the guideline number one, there are going to be 8 guidelines, so we're almost finished. And the guideline number one is that traditional astrology is clear about what is good and what is bad. Modern astrology is ambivalent about what is good and what is bad, since everything is relative from the modern perspective because of the things that we've mentioned so far. We have to remember traditional astrology has malefic planets, have malefic houses, have malefic lordships, and it also has benefic planets, benefic houses, and benefic lordships. So it is very clear cut what is good and what is bad. Mars in Cancer is bad because it's its fall. Saturn in Aries is bad because it's its fall. If you have, for example, if you have the moon debilitated in Lagna, in Scorpio, and you have Mars in the 12th in Libra, and you have Saturn in the second in Sagittarius, it's really bad because you have bad dignity for the moon in Lagna, and at the same time you have Papa Katari. This is just an example of how things are bad. But in modern astrology, a Mars in Cancer is not necessarily bad. It is something that you have to work with. It is something that you have to work. For example, your will has to work with the idea of changing emotions. So here we see that modern astrology opts for the idea that nothing is really bad, nothing is good, nothing is, everything is relative, because it extrapolates the modern thought in astrology. Okay, and usually you're not going to see that in traditional schools, and you're going to see this mainly on modern schools of astrology. Guideline number 2 is the following: traditional astrology focuses more on prediction than on psychological attributes, while modern astrology focuses more on psychological attributes than on prediction. This is very, very, very common. You read the traditional texts, and you're going to see that, descriptions describe concrete results. This and this will create a widow. This and this will create richness. This and this will create a job, and so on and so forth. Because in ancient times, people were concerned about concrete things. And we're going to see that later on in another guideline. But they weren't so concerned about psychological attributes. Yes, psychological attributes are located in traditional astrology, and we can quote, for example, the Pancha Mahapurusha yogas in traditional Vedic and traditional Jyotish, which kind of attribute the psychological attributes. But if you read Parashara, if you read Brihad Jataka, the things that they say for prediction are much more important than the psychological attributes. While modern astrology is very, it's more biased. It's a lot more psychological attributes, more than attention to prediction. As some modern astrologers know, prediction in modern astrology is kind of complicated. And if you use prediction, you're using basically traditional techniques applied to the modern context. For example, you can use perfections in modern astrology. You can use the return of planets in modern astrology to do predictions. But psychological school, modern schools of astrology are, kind of lacking in their capability to predict. We might exclude maybe Uranian astrology from that, but in essence, it's just more of a concentration on how you are as a person. Oh, you have Mars in Cancer, so you have to deal with your emotions. You have to be very wary about not letting your emotions dictate what you do in the world, right? But if you see the traditional perspective, this is bad. And the prediction will be that when this time period comes, it's going to be kind of difficult, right? So you see here that modern astrology relies more on psychological attributes. It relies more on psychological interpretations because, what is life? What is prediction? How do we know that this exists? You have to have a certain degree of faith, a certain degree of religious sensibility that comes from a traditional outlook. Guideline number 3 is the following: traditional astrology tends to be clearer and simpler than modern astrology in terms of lineage and technique. And this is very, very simple. Traditional astrology uses the traditional 7 planets. Traditional astrology uses, the 5 aspects, if we quote Hellenistic astrology, the simple Graha aspects from Jyotish. It kind of gets more complicated with Tajika and Persian astrology. And, Renaissance and medieval astrology carry on that Arabic tradition. But it's very simple, 7 planets, 12 houses, 12 signs. It might differentiate with the idea of the sidereal and the tropical zodiac, but it's very simple. While modern astrology, it's complicated. You have 3 more planets that just been discovered in the past 300 years. You have trans-Neptunian planets. You have asteroids. You have other things that go on. And at the same time, you know, this is something that in late antiquity, it was also done, the idea of creating lots, you know, the idea of having new lots every few years. You know, this is something that in late development of astrology in late antiquity was also very present. But in a way, the most important thing is lineage and technique. Traditional astrology has clear lineage. It might be shrouded in mystery, but it has clear lineage. Yotish, you know, we can quote Parashara, we can quote Baraha Mihira, we can quote classics in Hellenistic astrology, we can quote, you know, the founders, Petrosides, we can quote Hermes Trismegisto, we can quote Asclepio, we can quote Petrosides, I said Petrosides already. We in Arabic astrology, we can quote, you know, mashallah, we can quote other people, but in essence, they all have a lineage, and their technique is very clear, very simple. While in modern astrology, it's very difficult to have lineage. For example, the founder of human design said that he got that from an entity. You know, at the same time, evolutionary astrology is very difficult in quoting where the ideas came from, right? We have, you know, the big psychological astrologers of the 20th century, which were Rudyard, Jung. You know, these are people who you can quote to a certain degree, but they're very, you know, nebulous. They're not very clear many times. If you read Rudyard, it's a very, very difficult books to read. But there's not a clear idea of lineage. And if there are, it's basically traditional astrology from the Renaissance, from medieval times, and even from Hellenistic perspective. So that's very something that you have to have that you have to have in mind. And obviously, you know, the idea of the regencies, the idea of the asteroids even complicates things a lot more. Guideline number 4 is that astrology is heteropatriarchal, modern astrology is equalitarian. Traditional astrology was practiced by man for men. And this is maybe why people were more concerned about concrete things and not mainly psychological attributes, while modern astrology is open to all because, you know, hierarchies no longer exist. Egalitarianism is the law of the land. And my hypothesis is that this is why a lot of women are into astrology today, because karmically they haven't been able to practice it for a very long time. And yes, we have like a vague idea of maybe 2 women in antiquity that practice astrology. You know, Hypatia from the movie Agora, but she was, you know, an Alexandrian philosopher, astronomer. And there's also the idea of a Persian princess that I don't know her name in Muslim times. But in a way, you know, this was astrology practiced for men. You know, for example, Parashara has a part in Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra where he talks about female astrology and how, you know, the breast of the wife are going to feel. If you say that today in a modern context, in a modern astrological conference, then, you know, you're going to have tomatoes thrown at you. But this is the idea. You know, traditional astrology was very manly, was very heteropatriarchal, and, you know, women were relegated to a secondary position. Not necessarily bad, but they were part of society, but they were part from a domestic perspective, from a 4th house point of view. Important, but not seen, not written in books, and so on and so forth. And we have to also realize that, you know, in Vedic thought, there was, you know, religious practices that strictly, you know, relegated to mothers, to women, to the households. So this idea that women were oppressed is not necessarily true. It's basically a modern perspective from a philo-Marxist point of view. And while today modern astrology is basically equalitarian, anybody who wants to read astrology can learn astrology. This is good, this is bad. You know, there are no longer initiatic leagues, no longer mystery schools. So in a way, anybody who has the interest and the money and the time can learn astrology. Guideline number 5 is that traditional astrology, and this is very important, this has to do with death. Traditional astrology sees reincarnation as an arduous and polyvalent process strictly related to various religious literature and not necessarily sought after. While modern astrology sees reincarnation as an evolutionary and progressive process, not necessarily related to any serious religious literature. This is very, very important because guideline number 5 and 6 has to do with this. Traditional saw death as something to be transcended, you know, moksha, liberation from the wheel of samsara, the heaven to liberate ourselves from original sin, to liberate ourselves from, the chains of materialism. And we can also see this in Hermeticism. This idea of reincarnation as an evolutionary process is something modern. It is not traditional, okay? And at the same time, reincarnation did exist in traditional thought, but it was seen as something arduous, as something that was not necessarily sought after. And at the same time, it was seen as something, as a consequence of your actions. You can read the Bhagavad Gita, and it said that you live from a tamasic disposition, you're going to be reincarnated as donkeys or as goats or whatever. If you live a more sattvic disposition, then you're more predisposed to reincarnate in a higher loka, and so on and so forth. But it wasn't seen as something that, I want to wait for my next life to do more things. Reincarnation from the modern perspective keeps man in the world, keeps him relegated and chained to the sublunar levels of life. And it's seen as a progressive and evolutionary process with not necessarily any consequence. You can be an asshole and you're still going to be here, and you're going to live, and you're going to be reincarnated as a man. And at the same time, there are no religious literature associated to this type of view in terms of reincarnation. And if they exist, they are theosophical, they are anthroposophical, where they take ancient Hindu text or whatever, or text from the East, and they reinterpret them from the modern perspective of a person evolving, of progress, of this linear line of thought. Reincarnation was seen as something to be avoided, as something to be transcended, specifically through moksha. The Eastern perspective saw it more of a contemplative approach, of basically, meditating, of just relegating yourself from social life and becoming more in contact to God and achieving your samadhi and just liberating yourself from the chains of materiality. While in the Western perspective is more of a heroic idea of just doing heroic stuff in order to transcend. And once again, this was strictly relegated more or less in the Western perspective to heteropatriarchal institutions. While, reincarnation from the modern astrology point of view, just something that happens, and that there's something you grow into, and something that you have to explore, and something that you have to work on. But there is not this idea of just getting out of this world, of just going to another place, okay? You're just staying here, chained. And another guy, and at the same time, you don't have a clear lineage in terms of epistemological bibliography of where these ideas came from, and they came from mainly from anthroposophical and theosophical authors that later expressed themselves into New Age authors. At the same time, guideline number 6, traditional astrology generally see the nodes as malefic astrological significators, not related to reincarnation and past lives. Modern astrology tends to see the nodes as polyvalent and related to reincarnation and past lives. People have this wrong idea that Rahu and Ketu are future and past lives. You can read Parashar, you can read Barahmihira, you're never going to see that reference, because this was something that was developed in the 20th century in modern astrological schools of thought. Even in Hellenistic astrology, Rahu is sometimes seen as positive, Ketu not a lot, but Rahu and Ketu have never been seen in traditional thought as reincarnation significators or past life significators. This is something that comes from modern astrology. Reincarnation significators and past life significators, at least from Jyotish point of view, are sometimes extrapolated even from the 12th or 2nd, or maybe the 9th and 5th, specifically with the idea of Purva Punja also, which applies to the 5th, which would be past life credit, but also sometimes the 5th is future lives, the 9th is past lives, while the 12th is past life, the 2nd is future lives. But this has nothing to do with Rahu and Ketu. And this is something that a lot of modern Vedic astrologers do. And in a way, it's not modern. It's basically this idea of progressive evolutionary reincarnation from modern astrology. Rahu is the place where you have to go because you haven't had that experiences. Ketu is something that you already know because you already know that. But they add the idea that that's from past life and that's from future life. But this is just purely modern and has no real bibliography in traditional thought. We have to remember, Ketu is a moksha karka. It is not the past life karka. So Ketu is what we have to go to in order to liberate ourselves. And different modern astrologers have different interpretations in relation to this. But quote me, there is no real quote from any bibliography from traditional books where it says this. Guideline number 7, traditional astrology generally does not pay much attention to career and profession. Modern astrology does. You have to remember that in traditional thought, the people who worked were slaves. The people who worked were Shudras. The people who worked were maybe the Vaishyas. The Brahmins and the Kshatriyas did not work. Hence, the idea of profession, the idea of career, the idea of the 10th house of what we're going to do in this consumerist society was not relevant in traditional thought. And at the same time, the idea of astrology as a profession was not necessarily seen as that in ancient traditional thought. It was seen something as that Brahmins used to do as part of their spiritual practice. It was seen as something that scholars might do as part of their, inquisitive nature. Modern astrology, on the other hand, has a lot of emphasis on profession. And, you can quote, if you read, for example, B.B. Raman's books, the little square books, you're going to see that he says, there's a quote, and I heard this from my teacher and I read it, that, profession is a hard nut to crack because you don't have traditional bibliography in order to know how to predict the career of the Yataka, mainly because there are no traditional significators, and that's why predictions for career is something that are more modern techniques. Okay. And finally, the final guideline that we're going to be discussing today is that traditional astrology was usually reserved for a minority, both in practice and application, while modern astrology is accessible to all in theory. Traditional astrology was part of a minority, of a hierarchical minority for Brahmins, maybe, I don't know if Kshatriyas, but maybe Brahmins or Kshatriya Brahmins, Parashumara, for example. But the idea here is that it was allocated specifically to a certain minority of people who were initiated, who had the capability of reading and writing, who had the capability of having the sensibilities necessary to understand this. Now, modern astrology, anyone can learn astrology. And that's where, that is good, that is bad at the same time, because a lot of people can learn it, but, people who might not have the best intent in mind might, do things that are not necessarily ethical, that are not necessarily moral. You see this a lot with a lot of Jyotishis in India, where they, complain about the type of person who get into Jyotish today, and so on and so forth. So basically, that's my click to add title. That's basically my presentation. So Ashwin, thank you very much. And if there are any questions, I can take them. Are you there, Ashwin? Ashwin. Oh my God, I'm alone. So, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, there you go.
My computer just hung up and it took a little bit of time to kind of unmute.
Okay, no problem. How many questions do I have?
I know there was a little bit of chat that I and Eduardo had on the comment section. So there was no questions as such, but Eduardo, let me just read what Eduardo said for you. One moment.
Eduardo Gramalia.
Yeah.
Hi. Saludos, Eduardo.
Okay, so what does it say here? Okay, he writes, of course, theosophy is modern. Maybe you mentioned it too close to spiritualism. They're quite different. So that's what he says. So
no, that's true. That's very true.
Yeah, that's true. Of course, the Theosophical Society and the idea of theosophy and the New Age movement kind of drew a lot of ideologies from the ancient philosophies, and I just got it confirmed from Eduardo that even Greek philosophy has influenced.
That's very true.
yeah, Theosophical Society. So I thought it was just the Eastern traditions, like the ancient Hindu and Buddhist traditions, but there is a lot of Greek influence as well. That's what it was.
Definitely.
So
And at the same time, you know, modern astrology is basically like an alliance of four influences. You have the Spiritists, you have the Theosophical Society, and at the
yeah,
same time, you have the psychologist of the early 20th century, and at the same time, this consumerist modern approach to astrology. And there you have like the idea of what modern astrology would be. You could also add the idea of secularism and also the idea of, you know, the scientificism involved in secular society and so on and so forth.
okay. So okay, and by the way, the thing that you told about evolutionary astrology, we're not sure at this point of time whether there is a real base. I don't mean to say base, but there is a real textual reference as to from where they really got the technique of reincarnation, the ideology of karma, and all those. Um, but still, I'm pretty much sure that it's not what Vedic astrology or Vedic system prescribes about reincarnation or karma. It's probably different. But we need some evolutionary astrologers to kind of come and shed light. So tomorrow you can probably write some questions, because Steve Wilson is lecturing tomorrow. He's an evolutionary astrologer, so he probably will be the better person. But I would like to have Jeffrey Wolf Green answer your questions, but at this point it's not possible. So so
Cool.
okay, Steve Wolfson will probably answer some of your questions. So that will be the right forum for you to kind of, I mean, not only for you, but for every one of us to kind of clear some void of it. So thank you so much, Fernando, for joining. It was an authoritative lecture, and I'm sure
Authoritative. Thank you.
I'm sure people will kind of enjoy it. You raised many questions, and I hope we'll find some answerings.
Take care. Thank you, Ashwin.